Good morning, everybody. This morning, last week, John Mark showed us about how brave Peter could be, and he was very bold and brave, very often, so much he walked on water. But today's lesson, we see a kind of different side of Peter. Was entitled Peter's Denial. And so we'll read through the three scriptures that the book provides for us, and then we'll go from there. First, starting with John chapter 13, I'm going to read the whole chapter. It was just before Passover feast. Jesus knew that the time had come for him to leave this world and go to the Father. Having loved his own who were in the world, he now showed them the full extent of his love. The evening meal was being served, and the devil had already prompted Judas Iscariot, son of Simon, to betray Jesus. Jesus knew that the Father had put all things in his power, and that he had come from God and was returning to God. So he got up from the meal and took off his outer clothing and wrapped a towel around his waist. After that, he poured water into a basin and began to wash his disciples' feet, drying them with the towel that was wrapped around him. He came to Simon Peter, who said to him, "Lord, are you going to wash my feet?" Jesus says, "You do not realize now what I'm doing, but later you'll understand." "No," Peter said, "you shall never wash my feet." Jesus answered, "Unless I wash you, you have no part with me." "Then, Lord," Simon replied, "not just my feet, but my hands and my head as well." And Jesus said, "A person who has had a bath needs only to wash his feet. His whole body is clean, and you are clean, though not every one of you." For he knew who was going to betray him, and that is why he said not everyone was clean. When he had finished washing their feet, he put on his clothes and returned to his place. "Do you understand what I've done for you?" he asked. "You call me teacher and Lord, and rightfully so, for that is what I am. Now that I, your Lord and teacher, have washed your feet, you should also wash one another's feet. I have set you an example that you should do as I have done for you. I tell you the truth, no servant is greater than his master, nor the messenger greater than the one who sent him. Now that you know these things, you will be blessed if you do them. To all of you, I know those I have chosen, but this is to fulfill Scripture. He who shares my bread has lifted up his heel against me. Now I'm telling you now before it happens, so that when it does happen, you will believe that I am he. I tell you the truth, whoever accepts anyone I send accepts me, and whoever accepts me accepts the one who sent me." And after he had said this, Jesus was troubled in spirit and testified, "I tell you the truth, one of you is going to betray me." The disciples stared at one another, at a loss to know which of them he meant. One of them, the disciple who Jesus loved, was leaning next to him. Simon Peter mentioned to this disciple, "Ask him which one he means." And leaning back against Jesus, he asked him, "Lord, who is it?" And Jesus answered, "It is the one to this piece of bread when I have dipped it in the dish." Then dipping a piece of bread, he gave it to Judas Iscariot, son of Simon. As soon as Judas took the bread, Satan entered into him. What you are about to do quickly." And Jesus told him, but no one at the meal understood why that Jesus said these things to him. And then I want to go ahead and go to Matthew, the 26th chapter. And we'll read 66 through 75. '50s, no, 66. All right. Then the high priest, we'll start there. Then the high priest tore his clothes, and he said, "He has spoken blasphemy. Why do we need to hear more witnesses? Look now, you have heard his blasphemy. What do you think shall do? He is worthy of death," they answered. Then they spit in his face and struck him with their fist. Others slapped him and said, "Prophesy to us, Christ. Who hit you?" Now Peter was sitting out in the courtyard, and a servant girl came to him. You were also with Jesus of Galilee, he said. But he denied it before them all. I don't know what you're talking about, he said. Then he went out to the gateway, where another girl saw him and said to the people there, This fellow was with Jesus of Nazareth. He denied it again with an oath, I do not know the man. After a little while, those sitting there with Peter said, Surely you're one of them, for your accent gives you away. Then he began to call down curses on himself, and he swore to them, I do not know the man. Immediately a rooster crowed, and Jesus remembered the word Jesus had spoken. Before the rooster crows, you will disown me 3 times. And he went outside and wept bitterly. And the last is John, the 21st chapter, and I certainly skipped over the last, in my last reading, the part that I really should have read, but we'll get back to that. John, the 21st chapter, 15, starting with verse 15. When they had finished eating, Jesus said to Simon Peter, Simon, son of Jonah, do you really love me more than these? Yes, Lord, he said, you know that I love you. And Jesus said, feed my lambs. Again, Jesus said to Simon, son of John, do you truly love me? And he said, yes, Lord, you know that I love you. And Jesus said, take care of my sheep. And a third time he said to him, Simon, son of Jonah, do you love me? Peter was hurt because Jesus asked him a third time, do you love me? He said, Lord, you know all things. You know that I love you. And Jesus said, feed my sheep. I tell you the truth, when you were younger, you dressed yourself and went where you wanted. But when you're old, you will stretch out your hands and someone else will dress you and lead you where you do not want to go. All right, so let's go back now to the narrative. I think it is, when we go, I think we need to start before this time. Jesus and his disciples had been in Samaria and Galilee and Samaria, and Jesus said, it's time to go to Jerusalem. Now, the last time he was there, they tried to stone him, but he walked right through them. And his disciples were very alarmed. They said, you know they're going to kill you. They're trying to kill you. And Jesus keeps saying, the Son of Man is going to be betrayed, and he's going to be put in the hands, and they're going to crucify him. He's been telling them this over and over, which they have not really understood, but at least they understand that the people are trying to kill him. The Jews are trying to kill him in Jerusalem. And so he says, as we're back, and he argued with him. In fact, Peter says, tells him, do not go, and he said, get behind me, Satan. He tells that to Peter because he said, you do not understand the things of the Spirit. You are thinking just for the body. And when that discussion in the chapter John 11, starting with verse 7, he said, let us go back to Judea. But Rabbi, they said, a short while ago the Jews tried to stone you, and yet you're going back there? And Jesus answered, are there not 12 hours of daylight? And the day will not stumble, for he sees the world's light. It is when he walks by night that he stumbles, for he has no light. After he said this, he went on to tell them, our friend Lazarus has fallen asleep, but I'm going there to wake him up. And that story goes on. And then finally in verse 16, they are still, even though Lazarus is dead, they said, if he's asleep, then just leave him. We don't need to go back. And then Thomas, doubting Thomas, said to the rest of the disciples, let us go also, that we may die with him. And so the apostles, Thomas and the apostles, knew what they were heading for. Now that doesn't mean it's going to be, you can think ahead to something that's coming, and when it gets there, you're not prepared for it anyway. But Thomas says, let's go with him, and we'll die there with him. And so now the scene shifts back to John 13, and it picks up during the Passover meal. Earlier on Thursday night, they had eaten the roasted lamb, the bitter herbs, and drunk the wine. The night had started with an argument on whether Jesus could wash Simon's feet or not. Jesus said, that he needed to. And Simon says, bold, I'm going to call him Peter. Bold Peter says, "Oh, no, you're not washing my feet." And then Jesus explains to him, "Yes, if I have a part of you, you're going to." And he says, "Oh, well, then wash my whole body." And Jesus says, "That's not the whole point here." Jesus was being a servant, and he was doing an object lesson to show all of them. The discussion right before this was James and John and their mother saying, "Who's going to be greatest in the kingdom?" That's where their mind had been. And so now Jesus said, "You don't understand. You need to be a servant if you're going to be the greatest in the kingdom." And he does this. The master, he goes down and he washes their feet and dries them with a towel and then says, "You need to understand that this is what we're all about. Serving each other and loving each other and not being drawn apart." He knew what was before him and he knew what was before them. And love was the only way that unity could exist within them, because it was going to be a rough night, and it's going to be a rough tomorrow, and then it's going to be a rough week until he appears to them again. And so Jesus explained that this was a service that a servant should have done, but no one did it. And so he explains that. Now, he goes on and he tells them about his betrayal, that it's going to happen. Now, they do not understand, but they say, "Who's going to betray you?" And John says that it was the servant that Jesus loved, the disciple that Jesus loved. By the way, John is the only one who calls himself that. None of the rest of the apostles say that about John. Now, or the writers. Does that mean it didn't happen? Well, no. He is the one leaning against Jesus' chest, so he can say that. But he is, I find it interesting anyway, that John is the only one. And he doesn't identify himself. He just says, the one that Jesus loved. Now, Jesus has said he loved all of them, but there was a close bond there. And so he says, "The one who breaks bread with me, whose hand is in the dish," and this had been foretold, he said, "He is the one who will betray me." And so they ask, "Who is it? Who is it?" And, Peter says, "John, ask him." And so John turns around and asks him, and he said, "The one I hand this bread to." Now, each of the accounts are a little bit different on how it's done, but in this account, he dips the bread and he hands it to Judas. And Judas, who already had the devil enter him, now it is sealed what he's going to do. And Jesus said, "What you do, do quickly." Jesus had resigned himself to what was coming, not completely, because he's going to go to Gethsemane and he's going to beg God 3 times, "If it's possible, take this away. If there's any other way, take this away." And so, but he's resigned himself that if this is God's will, he's going to do it. And so, all up through there, he's been saying, "The time is not yet, the time is not yet." And then he's saying that week, "It is time, and I'm ready to get this over with." He's ready to go home, back to the Father. He's been separated now for 33 years from the Father, physically, or with the Father at the right hand. And so, though it is going to take this, he's ready to go home. And so he tells Judas, what you're doing, go quickly. And so no one else understood. And he says, "I'm giving you a new command." This is through the other 11. He said, "I'm giving you a new command, that you love one another." And he's beginning to show them the full extent of his love. He has said, "Greater love hath no man, that he lay down his life for his friends." And that's what he's about to do. And so they get ready. And he says, "I'm going." And Peter says, "Why can't we come with you?" And he said, "I'll lay down my life for you." Here's Peter the brave again. And he says, "Will you really?" And then he says, you're going to disown me 3 times before the morning. And Peter does not, it's not going to happen. In Luke 24, Luke adds that Jesus says to him, Satan has asked to sift you like wheat, to take you apart and see what's there. But I have prayed for your faith. When you do, not if you do, but when you do, come back and strengthen your brothers. Now, one thing about Peter, he is impetuous, he is brave, and he puts his foot in his mouth often, but when he repents, he is stronger when he comes back. And that same strength that makes him so bold makes him the one to help comfort the others and strengthen them until Jesus comes back again, though they all have a problem. And in verse 33, he says, I am ready to die for you or with you. He's not, however, ready to go to prison with him in just a little while. But neither, need to keep in mind, Matthew tells us that when Jesus tells him that all would be offended when God smites the shepherd and the sheep scatter. But after I'm raised up, I will go to Galilee. And Peter says, me? No, never. And all of the rest of them say the same thing. See, we focus in on Peter's denial, but all 11 of them had said the same thing. That will never happen. Now, Judas is already gone, but all the rest of them are so sure of themselves. Now, Jesus said in the course of the meal, does anyone have a sword? I had told you not to take anything, but if you have a sword. And they say, well, we got 2. And he said, that's enough. They want to know, was that enough? They could go out and get others. Now, I am supposing that these are the zealots that had their swords with them. But Peter gets his hand on one in a little while. And so, like I said, Matthew confirms that they all said it. And now the scene shifts to the garden. Peter, James, and John keep falling asleep. He has separated them out, as he often does, the kind of inner circle. And he's praying, and he keeps coming back. He says, stay awake and pray. And they keep falling asleep. And finally he says, okay, rest. It is time. And when he was talking to them, a mob of Jews approach him. Now, I've always kind of pictured in my mind that it was the Roman soldiers with the Jews, but it was not. This was a Jewish guard that came after him. The Romans have not been involved yet. This was from the chief priests, the high priest who sent them. And so, as they approach him, stepping out of the crowd, Judas kisses him. And Jesus says to him, really? With a kiss? You're going to do this? And all the others are standing there shivering because they don't know what's happening. They who were ready to die with him are now scared to death. Now, Peter, he says, okay, I'm going to fight for you. So he grabs a sword and he cuts off the high priest's servant, Malchus, and Jesus says, put your sword away. He said, if I wanted something done, all I would have to speak, and 12 legions of angels are there. Now, 12 is a perfect number. That does not limit how many angels he could have called, but he could have done this. What are you puny 11 going to think you're going to do with 2 swords that 12 legions of angels would not do? Jesus said, that's not what this is about. He said, would you stop me from going about my Father's business? And so, as I said, Jesus reaches down and he puts Malchus's ear back on. I think it's really interesting that when this happens, the Gospel of Mark, which very probably Peter had, this was probably the Gospel of Peter, as Scott has pointed out, he leaves this incident entirely out. He doesn't talk about this. So I don't know if that was just not a proud moment for Peter. Once again, he was brave, he was bold, and he was ready, and Jesus said, no. And you know that had to embarrass him. He just kind of stepped back, probably. And Matthew said Jesus hails him and explains all of this. And they lead him away back to the city. Now, he's been outside in the garden, but he had said, no prophet dies outside of Jerusalem. That is where the Jews have all killed their prophets. And that it at least comes from Jerusalem. Now in Mark, wait a minute. That's 1, 3, 4. Okay. Mark tells us that when this happens, that they all scatter. And so all 11 desert him. They basically deny him. They hit the trail. Now Peter, and later on we find John, evidently follow from afar off. But there is a certain young man who's there with just a linen tunic over him, and they grab at him, and he takes off and leaves everything behind. This is probably John Mark. Most scholars think that this may have well been John Mark that was there at the time and ran away. He would have been very young. And so now the trial begins. We skip to John the 18th chapter for the trial. This is the first of 3 trials that happened that night. So they take him to Annas first, and he was the Jewish high priest. Now, the Jews had a succession of high priests all down through from Aaron's family, and he was their high priest. However, he was not the only high priest. His son-in-law, no, his father-in-law, Caiaphas, his wife's dad, had enough Roman influence that the Romans picked who the high priest was also. So you had a Jewish high priest and a Roman picked high priest. And they didn't care if it was from Aaron's family. They didn't care what. It was just, and it was a bribery appointment. Whoever could pay the most money became the high priest. And so evidently Caiaphas was fairly well off. But anyway, the first trial starts, and Annas is questioning him, and Jesus is slapped, and then at the end of it he is abused, and then they send him on. Well, now evidently during this one, John tells us that Peter is there. Now Caiaphas is I need to get to that anyway. Peter is known, and he to the high priest, and so he gets to come closer. Now he's there in the courtyard, and the young maiden comes and says, "You were with Jesus of Nazareth." And he said, "Oh, no, I don't even know him. I don't know who you're talking about." And so then it appears that he is taken bound to Caiaphas now for the second trial. Now, and see, I had always kind of pictured that it was all around the same place that happened. But it seems to be that at the second trial is when he denies him the second and the third time. And so when he gets to Caiaphas' house, John gets to go in, and that may have been the other one, but John gets to go in, but Peter doesn't. He gets to sit outside. And so he is warming himself by the fire, And preachers have been known to say he's warming himself by the devil's fire. But he's warming himself, wanting to know what's happening, but still wanting, if he had a cloak of invisibility, he would have had it on at this time. But he did not. And so the maid comes and said, "You're a Galilean. Your accent betrays you." And so evidently it was kind of like a southern accent and one of those other accents that you can obviously tell what region of the country people were from. And so he was a Yankee Jew. And all of them were southern Jews. And so she knew where he was from. And he says, "No, I don't know the man. You got it wrong. Don't put me with him." And then later on, with those around the fire, someone else says, that said, "Oh yeah, you were with him. There's no doubt about it." And Peter says this time with an oath. In Matthew it says, he began to curse and swear and say he does not know Jesus. And then John records something that I think just chills me to the bone. The rooster crows right before dawn, and it says Jesus turned and looked at him. Now, can you imagine being Peter? Scared to death out there, and you've just done the same thing 3 times that Jesus said you're going to do. And he says, "Oh, I am not going to. If everybody else in the world does, I'm not going to." And all of a sudden, you hear yourself saying that and cursing and bringing down curses. And then you hear the rooster for the last time. And you're beginning to be so ashamed. And you look back at Jesus, and he turns from where he's being questioned and beaten and looks at you. Now, Peter probably hits the lowest point here than he's been. And he weeps bitterly. Now, Jesus has let him know it was going to happen. But lest we forget, Peter denies him by speaking, but all the other 11 counting Judas, because he did too, they have already betrayed him too. How did they betray him? They took him off and run, knowing that the Jews have come to get him, knowing that Jesus has said over and over that the chief priests, the Jews, are going to deliver me to the Gentiles to be killed. And they've been saying, "What does that mean? What does that mean?" Well, now they know what it means, and they're not there. Now, yes, the scriptures kind of focus in on Peter, because Jesus has said to him, he didn't say to the others, "Now, when you deny me, turn around, strengthen yourself, build up your faith." He said, "I'm telling you this to build up your faith, not to chastise you for what you're about to do, but to build up your faith." And he said, "And when this happens, strengthen your brethren." Now, Peter, this time, he has fallen, and he needs to repent. And that's what Jesus had called on him to do. Now, like everything else, Jesus told them before it happened for several reasons. One, to build their faith when it happened, so they would know, he has already told us this. This was prophecy. And he has told us from the Old Testament that he was the fulfillment, and then it happened. He also told them to prepare for the shock, because this did not come out of, just all of a sudden. He's been preparing them for this for a while, so that it would not be a complete shock. And he's been telling them also to help them understand that this was part of God's plan. They still cannot see that. They won't be able to see that until they see the risen Jesus. They will not be able to understand what Jesus told them. And then they say, He told us he was coming back, and they're shocked. I mean, they run for the tomb. And so in 21, when in John 21, the scene shifts to in Galilee afterwards, when he says, Peter, do you love me? Do you like me? Or he says, do you love me? And he says, well, are you fond of me? Do you like me? And Peter is, he's using different Greek words, different degrees. And Peter is saying, I do. Why are you questioning that? And he tells him to feed my sheep. Now, Peter is going to be the main spokesman we read about in Acts, the 2nd chapter on Pentecost. This is a week afterwards, so some 40 days after that, sometime during that. Then Jesus, he is going to be the one that feeds Jesus' sheep. Now, the other 11, counting Matthias, that was added, they're all up speaking and speaking to the people in languages they have not learned and everybody's understanding. But Peter is the main one. He gets to deliver the gospel for the first time. And so you see that Jesus may have loved John, but he did not call on him to feed my sheep. He does call on him to take care of Mary, his mother, from the cross. And he continues to do that from then on. But he asks Peter, because Peter, once again, he may put his foot in his mouth, he may fall, but when he gets up, he's stronger. And he is the one to broadcast the fact that the kingdom is here. No.
Because in that betrayed and denied the Gentile brethren later on by withdrawing from them.
He does. He has a problem with that. He is a Jew inside and out. He is as much Jew as Paul ever thought he was going to be. So there's a problem with that. And from what I hear, there's a problem with that even now among the Jewish Christians. That Gentiles are not accepted very well. They have said, yes, somebody said something. Yeah, and he had at least 4 brothers and sisters, and he had sisters too, but he was the one, and he knew that at that time they were probably, it looks like they were still unbelievers until he rises from the grave, and then they suddenly realize who has been with them all this time and become very faithful. James and Jude both become very faithful. But Jesus hands her off to John because he knows Mary believes and John believes, and right afterwards, when she needs somebody, because the Bible has said, and a spear will pierce your own heart too. And he's referring to this, the crucifixion. And so he knew Mary needed him right then. Now, the others, as I said, they believe and probably were a big part of her life later on too. But John is the one that takes care of her. Anyway, so to wrap it up, yes, Peter denies him, but he's not the only one. He is the very vocal one. And all of this, we just see this leading up. The boldness, and Jesus saying, no, over and over to him until he gets to this point. And Jesus says, now, Peter, you're going to come through this. And when you do, you remember I've told you this. And you strengthen the brethren. And so Jesus gives him a mission more than the other apostles. He gives him a mission because of his faith and because of his denial. Any other questions? Yes. Right. Oh, you're exactly right. They have the apostles who were with him for 3 years continually and saw all the miracles and were able to do miracles because of him. And yet, the Bible says later on, blessed are those who not who live through it, but look back in faith and believe what is written down. Any questions? All right. Thank you very much for your attention.